you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Good. Well, look, thank you very much for the invitation, both of you. I'm going to start by just apologising to those of you who are near the front. I'm afraid I lost a front tooth in a minor bicycle accident a couple of days ago, so I'm not looking in the greatest shape in terms of my dentistry. I'm not sure that the National Health Service is going to sort that out for me back in the UK. I think I should be looking for an Italian dentist over the next few days. But anyway, I just thought I'd put that out there to get the sympathy vote. And just I thought some of you at the front would be thinking, he looks a bit strange. Anyway, so look, I'm going to use quite a lot of my own material today in terms of drawing on that to talk to you about UK portrayals and perceptions of the EU post-Brexit. So, how many of you actually remember June 2016 when Brexit happened? Put your hand up if you have a conscious memory of the United Kingdom voting to leave the European Union in June 2016. Some of you, about half of you. Okay, I'd like to talk quite a bit about Brexit, the actual referendum today, as well as the post-Brexit situation. So this is what I'm going to look at: a background to and explanations for the Brexit vote. We're going to look at the British tabloid press as an agenda setter. We're going to talk briefly about what happened to this idea that, Brexit means everybody else is going to leave the EU. Brexit, Gexit, Itexit. It's not actually happened, has it? We're then going to talk about the implications for Brexit for the UK and the future EU-UK relationship. Political parties and public opinion. And I'll close with just a few words about what is likely to happen next. So, what we see from the Brexit vote in 2016 is that it's very polarised in terms of the demographics. To quote Nick Pearce, the Brexit referendum pitted working class voters in post-industrial towns and cities, deprived seaside resorts and the agribusiness rural areas of England and Wales against the young, middle class and university educated cosmopolitan centres. Now that is a little bit too polarised in terms of the framing. It's not that straightforward. But there is something to be said at looking at the demographics of the Brexit voter. It does tell us, broadly speaking, the story that Nick Pearce describes in that quote. So, I tell you what, if I had been David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom's advisor in 2016, or 2015, or 2014, when he was thinking about, should we have a referendum on EU membership? I'm under pressure. I'm under pressure from the media. More of that in a minute. I'm under pressure from the Eurosceptic wing of my political party, the Conservative Party. I'm under pressure from UKIP, the UK Independence Party, and Nigel Farage. I think I'm going to have a referendum. I think we can win it. I really do. If I'd been his advisor, and I did predict Brexit in an article that was published a year before it happened, so it's not me sort of speaking after the event. But if I'd been his advisor, I would say, don't do it, David. Don't do it. You are running a massive risk, and here is why. First up, there's a bunch of literature in political science about referendums called the punishment trap, i.e., you can take 5% off the vote of a leader or a government because whatever the question, people just want to have a go at the incumbent president or prime minister. So there's a reason maybe not to have a referendum. And then, the polls all the way along were very close. They were very tight. There wasn't a massive majority in favour. And then, Britain has the highest knowledge deficit of any EU nation state. What do we mean by that? Brits know least about the EU, how it works, how it functions, according to the Eurobarometer data, which looks at data across the EU 27 as it is now, across the 28 as it was then. And then, I would have said this, there's a massive British Eurosceptic tradition in the UK, which is built around this idea of an island mentality. Culturally and linguistically, we're close to the Anglosphere, Australia, New Zealand, United States of America. And then, sovereignty was a massive thing in British Eurosceptic discourse as far back as the Maastricht Treaty, which is when the community goes from economic to political and changes its title to the Union. And then we've got Farage, Nigel Farage. They were on the up, his party, the UK Independence Party. They performed very well at the 2014 European elections. There are dangers in having this referendum, Mr. Cameron, if you are campaigning for the United Kingdom to stay in, which is what he did. And then the media, which we'll talk about. We have a right-wing press in the United Kingdom, led by the tabloid press, which is extremely Eurosceptic, and it has been for a number of decades, particularly since Maastricht. And then if you looked at other referendums that have taken place, in the Netherlands, in France, in Ireland, you would see that the referendum results did not always go the way that the governments wanted. They weren't referendums about membership. They were things like the Constitution, or things like membership of the Euro, in places like Sweden. But there were negative votes. Don't just assume because this is the big picture about membership that the Brits are going to suddenly vote in favour of staying in. So, for all of those reasons, I would have urged huge caution to the British Prime Minister when he decided to have a referendum about British membership of the European Union. Now, why did it happen? There's a bunch of literature out there. I'm not going to spend too long talking about it. The island mentality. We have to perhaps put some blame on the EU itself, failing to embrace the reform agenda. The campaign. Britain Stronger in Europe campaign was very, very one-dimensional, as we'll see. Rational choice economics. The EU's okay. You better stay in because economically the uncertainty of coming out is greater. That's not a great zeitgeist around which to build a political referendum campaign. It's better than the alternative coming out. Whereas the Leave campaign was all about take back control, emotion, psychology. So migration is a massive issue, and then the role played by the media as well. If you're looking for a really good book to encapsulate the British Eurosceptic tradition, if you want to know more about the historical dynamics of it, really good book by a guy called Stephen George, former academic from the University of Sheffield. An awkward partner is called Britain in the European Community. He talks about the Channel being a psychological barrier. He talks about the special relationship with the USA. He talks about the fact that we were an empire in the United Kingdom and now we have Commonwealth countries. He talks about shared linguistic heritage. All of these things, he argues, have influenced the British Eurosceptic tradition today. Bear in mind, Britain wasn't occupied, it wasn't invaded. There wasn't this emotional desire for peace and the rationale for the European community that so dominated the Franco-German relationship in the build-up to the launch of the European community. Remember, France was invaded 3 times by Germany between 1870 and 1940. And I think we need to put the creation of the EU against that backdrop, the security needs for a closer European ties. Britain doesn't really feel that. Britain rules the waves, empire, unoccupied, victorious in the Second World War. And then back to the campaign itself. Vote Leave completely owned migration as an issue. I heard maybe 2 speeches bigging up migration, freedom of movement as a positive thing in the whole campaign. Maybe one was by the current mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and I can't remember who the other one was by. But the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign did not want to talk about the benefits of migration. It just wanted to talk about economics. And when 30% of the British electorate were saying, in opinion poll data, that they hadn't made up their mind which way to vote until the last week of the campaign, that is a lot of undecided voters who are getting cues from media which may have had some influence on the outcome. Britain Stronger in Europe. More jobs, lower prices. Economics. Europe's not great, but we can't come out. Was kind of how I would sum up the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign. Whereas we see Nigel Farage there, talking about refugees, illegal migrants, legal migrants, crises, security, conflating Schengen and the freedom of movement. We never had Schengen in the UK. Nobody could ever legally enter the European Union, the United Kingdom, without a passport. We never signed up to the Schengen Agreement. And yet the way Vote Leave framed their campaign, it's as if we were part of the Schengen Agreement. And I don't need to give you a definitional lecture about what the Schengen Agreement is and what the freedom of movement is. They're 2 very different things. Schengen is about border controls and passports. Freedom of movement is a much deeper thing, about the right to live, work, marry, settle, do whatever you like in another EU nation state. And of course, that picture that you see behind me, that's not refugees at the border of the UK. That goes back to the Syrian crisis. A lot of photos, a lot of images were used that, we could call, in the modern post-truth parlance, disinformation. So what about the media? Well, there was research conducted, and quoting from my article about the tabloid tales, which came out last year, research conducted by the Centre for Research and Communication Culture at the UK-based Loughborough University highlights the national press coverage during the campaign was highly polarised, with a coverage gap of 80% to 20% in favour of Leave. And what is clear is that the majority of this anti-EU framing, not all, but the majority is coming from the tabloids, the sensationalist newspapers, like The Sun, the Daily Mail, and the Daily Express. The kind of publications that I hope your profs tell you not to cite from in your briefing papers and your research papers. Let's just take some headlines. So what you get are two things, in my opinion. Well, three. One, you get what I would call soft issue, trivialized disinformation. Funny stories. The EU are going to ban bendy bananas. They're going to stop letting Brits buy eggs by the dozen. 12, imperial, old-fashioned measurement. These things are, there's no real truth to it. It may have been discussed by the European Commission and then put on the back burner. Then you get a slightly more full-on framing. German push for EU army. In other words, at that stage, a German chancellor was saying, well, maybe we should have closer EU defence and security. Maybe we should pool some of our resources. That's not having an army all walking around in the European Union uniform with stars on their shoulder. And then the one that the palace vehemently denied. Queen backs Brexit. When actually what she said at dinner to a journalist was, tell me 5 good things about the European Union. I'm interested. Not quite the same as saying that you support Brexit. And it wouldn't be for the role of a ceremonial head of state to get drawn into that discussion. So you've got this soft framing around trivia, and then you've got slightly more sinister framing, which is kind of harping back to nostalgia, Britain and Germany and conflict and all that kind of stuff. And then it moves, as we get closer to the referendum, to the issue of migration. But let's just take a little look at what we mean by tabloid. Oxford Dictionary. Typically popular in style and dominated by sensational stories, and a broadsheet, irrespective of the size these days because they've got smaller, are more serious and less sensationalist, in theory. So, tabloid, Express, Mail, Sun, Mirror, Star. We've got 5. Too many, some would say. Broadsheets. Times, Telegraph, Guardian, Financial Times. The Independent, maybe, which is now only online. But I think what's different about the UK is not just the presence of this sensational press, which is much more entrenched, I think, than other EU nation states, but it's the way British people consume newspapers. Every petrol station where you go and buy your gas, as the Americans call it, petrol is what we call it in English, every supermarket, newsagents where you buy your lottery ticket, you see all the headlines on show. And even if you're not buying the paper, you can see the headlines. You're digesting them, perhaps subconsciously. It's very difficult to measure what the impact of that is in terms of causality. Very difficult to measure empirically. Almost impossible. So let's just go back a little bit and talk about the Eurosceptic headlines. So I'm always a bit awkward translating what's on this headline. There's a British person at the front giggling. Up yours, Delors. Now Jacques Delors, those of you that have studied Europe, you will know as a former European Commissioner who I guess is responsible for the nuts and bolts, the policy of the introduction of the single currency and the euro. And what we see in this Sun headline is their typical kind of like light-hearted headline. Does anybody want to tell me what that means?
It's like the middle finger.
Yeah.
That would be the finger. Oh.
Yeah.
Michelangelo.
That's the middle finger is a double. It's up your nose.
It's rude. It's rude, yeah. But you get the idea. So we see loads of headlines like that in the tabloid press. Now, before we come on to look at today, I just want to go back a little bit again. We had a thing called the Leveson Inquiry in 2012, which was supposed to clean up our media, clean up our written press. It was based around a series of phone hacking scandals, members of the royal family, other famous celebrities in the UK, people like Hugh Grant, the actor I'm sure you're aware of. At that inquiry, former Conservative Prime Minister John Major said under oath, talking about the Sun newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch, who I'm sure you've heard of, he didn't like our European policies. This is when he was Prime Minister. And he wished me to change our European policies. If we couldn't change our European policies, his papers could not and would not support the Conservative government. Wow. Tabloid press trying to frame policy discourse to the United Kingdom, Her Majesty's government. Nice YouTube clip, you can find it if you want to hear him. John Major, he speaks beautifully clear English, so you won't have any trouble understanding him. Moving on. Tony Blair, next Prime Minister. The Sun, which is the newspaper of Rupert Murdoch, actually support Labour, Social Democrats, centre-left party, for the first time in a long time, and they win. But Lance Price stated in 1998, 1 year after Blair was elected, we've promised News International, which is the Murdoch Corporation, we won't make any changes to our European policy without informing them. Wow. And another key aide later on in his memoirs, Jonathan Powell, we should have been braver in confronting Murdoch and the other newspaper owners on the subject of Europe. So what we see is a tabloid press which really ups the ante around identity and migration in the final stages of the campaign. That's not a press release, that is from the Vote Leave campaign itself. Turkey is joining the EU. Come on. Really? Turkey's application to join the EU has been on the back burner for so long. And what we can also say is that both France and Austria think Rassemblement National Marine Le Pen, think Austrian Freedom Party, have in their constitutions or the way they frame this, that there has to be a referendum in those countries before Turkey can join the EU. And I can more or less tell you, without being an expert, that if you were to ask the French public or the Austrian public, do you want Turkey to join the European Union, I think you know what the answer is going to be. And it would have been the same back in 2016. It would have been a no. So not only is the application stalled for a number of reasons, there are also countries in the EU that would need to put this to referenda. So again, this feels like disinformation to me. And what we see is that the tabloid press increasingly focus on migration linked to national sovereignty, contestation of the freedom of movement, and Schengen, even though we don't actually have it, never had it. Around Maastricht, it becomes more pronounced. We go from economic to political union. The Big Bang enlargement, 2004, 8 Central and Eastern European countries joined. 2007, Bulgaria and Romania. The framing starts to be quite anti-Eastern European migrant. Then we go to the economic and financial crisis. It then goes back to being more general framing. And then we have the kind of humanitarian and refugee crisis, which we know of, and in many ways is still ongoing, emanating from 2015. All of this has kind of allowed, I think, the tabloid press to increasingly focus their anti-EU rhetoric around a kind of anti-migration framing, fusing the two issues, if you like. So, if you're interested a bit in that question, I do have that article that I mentioned. There's a shorter version here, which is in the UK Interchanging Europe blog. We feel like we showed relatively well that in the final stages of the campaign, the tabloid press had some impact. Again, as I said at the beginning, causality is a very difficult thing to demonstrate in the relationship between the media and public opinion. But if you're interested, take a look at that. So, what happens next? Well, if you read the British press and some other press around Europe, we were moving to referendums elsewhere. The amount of media work I did between 2016 and 2018, talking to the British media, with them asking me, is there going to be a referendum in France? No. Is there going to be a referendum in Italy? No, I don't think so. Is there going to be a referendum in Germany? No. Is there going to be a referendum in Denmark? Possibly. And yet, what we find is, despite the fact that Madame Le Pen calls herself Madame Brexit for a while, actually, we see her party move away from a policy of coming out of the EU and move away from getting rid of the euro, which was part of their manifesto prior to Brexit. And we get some people saying the future of the EU is at stake. this could be the end of the European Union. Rest assured, folks, it's not. 8 years on. So the reality is there hasn't been a rush for EU member states to have referenda on membership of the European Union. And I would argue that the reason for this is because it has been a nightmare for the United Kingdom to extricate itself from the European Union economically, politically, and culturally. And it took us a long time to do that. A long, long time. So, I think we will continue to see the Italian flag waving side by side with the EU flag. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And actually, we're seeing, call them what you wish to call them, your choice, far right, radical right, populist right. We're actually seeing that these political parties in France, Germany, Austria, and elsewhere are looking to change the European Union from within rather than exiting the European Union. So there has been a shift. And that makes sense for a lot of far-right, radical right parties. They gain a lot from being in the EU. They gain legitimacy, they get finance, funding for every MEP that's elected. So strategically it makes sense for them to stay in the EU. So we're not going to see a massive exodus, in my opinion. So, what are the implications of Brexit for the UK, and what are the implications in terms of the UK-EU relationship moving forward? I always think you can learn a lot when you study politics and leaders by the body language. So if you look at the first picture, you've got von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, with former Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And this is when they signed the Windsor Framework. And the Windsor Framework, to cut a long story short, is them trying to solve how's it going to work in Northern Ireland, when Northern Ireland borders the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is also part of the United Kingdom. Quite a bit of distance between them. Not a handshake for the actual photo. You get the idea. And then we move on to the middle photo, which is the new British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who was elected in July and has a majority of 174 seats in the UK Parliament. That's with an overall percentage vote of 33.5% of the vote nationally. But don't let me bore you with Britain's first past the post majority electoral system. But anyway, he's got a majority of 174 seats. So you might be thinking, yeah, what's he going to do about Europe? Is he going to get closer to Europe? Is he going to try to reinvigorate British relations with the EU? Is he going to try and maybe get the UK back into the EU? Well, let's find out. Before we do that, on the right, we have Sunak with French President Macron. Sorry. Thank you. Too many characters. We have Starmer with President Macron. Just over a week ago. This was for the 11th of November memorial in Paris. The first British Prime Minister since Churchill to attend the French memorial to the fallen soldiers of the First World War. Quite symbolic. Quite symbolic indeed. Does that point towards closer UK-EU relations? Well, yes and no, I would say. Yes and no. We're not going to talk about all of these, don't worry. So what are the implications of Brexit for the UK and future UK-EU relations? What are the economic implications? What are the political ones? What does it mean in terms of defence and security? What does it mean in terms of migration? What does it mean in terms of youth mobility and education? Erasmus? What does it mean for the environment? These are just some of the questions that we are chewing over in the UK in terms of our future relationship with the EU. What is the impact on each of those levels? I'm not going to talk about all of them. Some of them might feature in the Q&A. Now, if you did a cost-benefit analysis of what the UK has gained by exiting the European Union, I think the costs would heavily outweigh the benefits. And I think most people who have studied it economically, politically, culturally, would say the same. And yet, Keir Starmer has made it completely clear that the EU will not rejoin the EU, we won't rejoin the single market, and we won't have a customs union. This was just after he was elected. If you're an economist, and I'm sure there are some economists maybe in the room, you'll be thinking to yourself, well, how will you improve the UK's economic positioning with the EU if you ruled out both the single market and the customs union? Good question. I'm not sure I have an answer to that. This is the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK. Government office. They calculated Brexit will cost 4% of GDP per annum over the long term. And they admit that 4% of 2021 UK GDP is the equivalent of £32 billion cost per annum to the UK taxpayer. The amount of trade that Britain has lost with EU partners, particularly the ones that were geographically close, their main trading partners, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, less so Italy, has been quite drastic. You can find plenty of stats that will fill you in on that. And yes, we have a trade deal with Australia. But I'm not quite sure what that's bringing in terms of GDP. Nothing like. And plus, there's the environmental footprint of the United Kingdom trade deal with Australia compared with France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Researchers at UK Interchange in Europe, which is a think tank, which by the way is not uniquely pro-EU, they have been quite critical of the EU, they found that the economic cost of Brexit is large and near universal across all regions. We estimate that the output losses due to Brexit range from 5 to 10 percentage points of GDP. 73% of UK districts have seen economic damage due to Brexit, with 44% having experienced high costs. To me, it's a bit like climate change. It's quite hard to find data that tells you the opposite of that. And we've just had the governor of the Bank of England, who's not supposed to get involved in politics, in his Mansion House annual speech to investors, he is urging the United Kingdom to rebuild relationships with the European Union. I take no position on Brexit per se, he says, but I do have to point out the consequences. The impact on trade seems to be more in goods than services. So it's exports. So that's the economics. Let's talk about the defence. So there's been a lot of speculation which has been, I think, fueled in the last couple of weeks with the election of the President-elect in the United States of America. Is there going to be a more independent EU foreign policy, defence and security policy? And if so, is the United Kingdom going to play some kind of role in that? Well, we've already seen bilateral defence pacts between the United Kingdom and France. Tony Blair, Jacques Chirac, the San Malo Agreement in 1998. Cameron and Sarkozy, the Lancaster House Treaty in 2010. But if you're somebody that believes that we should be thinking long and hard about where the war in Ukraine is going and how, as Europeans, we are going to hope to regulate that, this has become very topical. What is going to be the role of the UK, if any, within closer EU defence and security cooperations? And we can maybe talk a little bit about that in the Q&A as well. My last case study really is going to be education and Erasmus. What I want to get across to you is this. Britain has a fantastic reputation for its universities. In terms of soft power, it's pretty good, huh? But now that European Union students are not able to pay British domestic fees because they're no longer, or the United Kingdom is no longer in the EU, what that means is that for you to go and study in the UK, instead of paying around 10, 11,000 pounds, you're going to be paying on average 22,000. And if you want to go to one of the better universities, the elite ones, Oxford, Cambridge, London School of Economics, you're going to be paying double that, because universities are able to set their own fees in the United Kingdom for overseas students, whereas they're not allowed to for domestic students. Now, I wasn't saying that to stop you going to study in the UK. No. Why I was saying that was to illustrate that the number of European students who have stopped coming to the United Kingdom has increased quite dramatically. We have less EU students, and this is one of the reasons why British universities are in a financial malaise. And I just heard from 2 universities that I know from my past where redundancies are about to be made. And it's like the elephant in the room. No one wants to talk about Brexit and the impact that it's had on higher education in the UK. When I used to lecture in the UK, and I worked at 3 different universities, in one of those, 20% of our undergraduate students in the area of political science and international relations were Europeans, i.e. not British, but from EU member states. And we relied on that income to get really good students. So it's not just about Erasmus, it's actually the impact it's had on British universities in terms of what the Americans call degree seekers, people doing the whole degree in one institution. It's also had an impact on Erasmus. I wrote back in 21 that I felt that the government's decision not to participate in the Erasmus scheme is short-sighted and will have negative effects. I still stand by that. I said you cannot put a price on what this offers in terms of soft power. You probably aren't aware that the Dublin government in the Republic of Ireland committed to subsidise all Erasmus students born in Northern Ireland. So going to places like Queen's University in Belfast at a cost of €2 million, which was quite a clever move in terms of soft power. And I think I actually saw a survey recently which indicated that the majority of under 25 Protestants in Northern Ireland were in favour of a united Ireland, which is unheard of if you know anything about political Irish history. I'm not suggesting that this move is the prime cause of that, but it's nevertheless an interesting development. And if you go to Ireland now, you'll see halls of residence being built in Dublin, Cork, Galway, elsewhere, which are being built primarily, as I understand it, to house Erasmus students. So one country's pain, in some ways you could argue, is another country's gain. And the thing I find so frustrating is that Erasmus is a fantastic opportunity for European students to learn English in the UK. And it's a fantastic opportunity for British students to learn other languages across the EU. So I think that's a vital part of the resetting of UK-EU relations that needs to take place. Now, I'm going to stop in a minute. You might say, well, James Startin, there you are, sitting there, pontificating about your home country and its future relationship with the EU. Surely it would make sense for closer cooperation. And look at those stats. This is the Brexit vote by age. 73% of under 25s, which is predominantly the age group in this room, I think. Some of you might be a little bit older. 73% voted to stay in. the European Union. Then we go up to the over 65s, and it was 40%. The problem with the Brexit vote was that 90% of over 65s voted, and only 2/3 of under 25s voted. So turnout was a key factor. You see this data, and you're thinking, this is the current data, this is from 2024. 59% in favour of return to the EU. Polls consistently show that over 70% of under 25s in favour of rejoining. You'll be asking me the question, well, why not? Why isn't Keir Starmer doing something about this? Why isn't he opening up an application to either join the EU or at least rejoin the single market, which many British businesses have been calling for? Well, I'm afraid it's not that simple with the land of British politics, the terrain and the lie of the land. First of all, it is part of the DNA, I believe, of the British Conservative Party now. We have had, between 2016 and 2024, 5 different Conservative Prime Ministers. Rishi Sunak, on the right, for 18 months. Liz Truss.
This is not displayed.
Oh, sorry, it's not displayed. Sorry. Okay, let's start with these then. Boris Johnson, David Cameron, it's like they're having a chat with each other. Brexit was your fault. No, it wasn't, it was my fault. You decided to have the referendum. Yeah, but you campaigned to come out of the EU. 2 Oxbridge boys having a chat together. So we've had 5 Prime Ministers. We've had, from 2010 to 2016, we had David Cameron. From 2016 to 29, we had Theresa May, who you see there. She tried to sort Brexit out but wasn't able to, so we went to Boris Johnson, and then we had for 50 days, after Boris Johnson had to go in 2022, we had Liz Truss in September and October 2022 for 50 days as Prime Minister. And then we had Rishi Sunak. We've now got Kemi Badenoch, who is the Conservative Party leader, who is a leader from Nigerian background. One thing you do have to say for the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, unlike the Labour Party, is that when it comes to picking leaders from different ethnic backgrounds, they've certainly done that. And we can't say the same for the Labour Party or the Lib Dems. But I digress. The main point I'm making is that it is in the interests of the Conservative Party to make Brexit a success. They have invested way too much in it, given up too many leaders. They can't go back. I don't think they will go back. And then we've got UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which morphed and became the Brexit Party and is now called Reform UK. When it was UKIP, it won 27% of the vote in the 2014 European elections. As the Brexit Party, we still voted in the European elections before we left the EU in 2019. 30% of the vote. And then finally it becomes Reform UK in 2021, and he's now an MP. We have 4 members of Parliament for the populist right, pro-Brexit, reform UK. The common denominator behind those three parties is Farage. He is the kind of personality behind the kind of right-wing populist Euroscepticism to the right of the Conservative Party. So at the level of the parties, although we have a Liberal Democrat Party that talks about being pro-EU, they still are not campaigning to take Britain back into the EU. This is the Liberals, who are an opposition party with 72 seats. Why? And I do think quite a lot of the explanation does revolve around the agenda-setting role that the British tabloid press continues to hold over this debate. Anything that the government does, even if it's like talk about going back into the Erasmus scheme, one of these papers will have a headline which says something like, "The Great Brexit Betrayal." And to me, it's an unhealthy hold that this press has over the British political class and the impact that it may have had in terms of influencing public opinion. So quite a few years back, I called it this kind of troika of public opinion, parties, and the media. We have a unique press in that they do set an agenda. BBC Radio News every morning, Sky News, BBC News in the evening, they review the front pages of these newspapers. They set the agenda in some ways for the next day's politics. It's quite an unusual system. And whereas we talk about social media, disinformation, social media and the Trump campaign, whatever, actually, in terms of the UK, I believe it's more the hold that these papers have, potentially on an older generation, who are not that social media savvy, rather than social media. Obviously social media is part of the mix because they, the messages from these papers get sent out by social media. But it's a lot to do with people that read and consume these papers as well, indirectly. So a final slide and a final point. What's going to happen? I think one of the French ambassadors called, he said, c'est le triple non to Europe. It's the triple no to Europe. They don't want to rejoin. They don't want to rejoin the Eurozone, or they don't want to rejoin the single market. They don't want to join a customs union. What do they want? That is the fundamental question that the British government faces over the next 6 months, year, 2 years. What is it that the United Kingdom wants in terms of a reset for its relationship with the European Union? What's that going to look like in terms of the economics, politics, defence, student mobility, Erasmus, education, environment, etc., etc. It's difficult to predict, but while this current environment exists in the UK, where caution seems to be the way forward for anybody in the political class who is pro the EU, I can't see much happening in the short term. So if one of the questions is, do you think the UK is going to rejoin the European Union? I think it's very unlikely in the next decade. And I say that as a Europeanist with some regret. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And it's not rhetorical to say that really it was very good food for thought. While we give time to the students to organize maybe some of their questions, just a few comments. One is a very nasty question from someone who's a professor of English linguistics. So I do love your country. And first question is, I will ask 3 questions, but all of them connected. First, are you sure that you would like the UK back? Because this is, I mean, there's plenty of debate, but I feel that the British made a very big mistake. It is touching part of our sensitivities and even of our, we really felt betrayed by them in a way. But this is just a provocative one. What was very interesting was that you were saying, first of all, I like very much, if I may go back, this one is very interesting circle, because then I would even had a leading Britain's conversation, because there's the other one that now is one of the propagators of this thing. So my question is, do you think that, given how the Leave EU and all the others campaigned during the Brexit, it's evident now that conservatives all over the world, because UK is a case, but it's the case of conservatives and populists all over the world, are very well coordinated in their campaigns, in the messages, a single message going around. For example, you remember during Brexit there was Brexiteers that were congratulating with Mr. Trump is congratulating with Brexiteers, and now it's the same here in Italy, etc. So what is, or better, how do we solve this kind of conundrum where conservatives are very well coordinated in communicating, very emotional narratives, as you said, as usual, migrations, etc. All these metaphors are very powerful, while progressives are a bunch of non-coordinated, or at least naive people who try to contrast these people. Thank you so much. And then we will...
Okay. I mean, the first question is an excellent question. Look, I certainly wouldn't blame the European Union if they said, non merci, we don't really want the United Kingdom back in the European Union. Because we have been what was described by Stephen George in that book, in one of the earlier slides, as a very awkward partner. We've never been fully committed to the European Union. I think we've always thought, and even if you go back to Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, who was like an instigator in the creation of the single market, I think in the UK we've always viewed the European Union as an economic thing. We've never really seen it as anything but economic. Whereas I think in other countries it's been seen as a political entity with a defence and security dynamic to it as well. So, would the European Union accept us back? I don't know. I think we would have to be making a very persuasive case. And bear in mind, we had a sweet deal. The Brits had a really sweet deal. We didn't have Schengen. We weren't in the Eurozone, but we were in the single market. And the reason why Starmer won't contemplate going back in the single market is because if you go back into the single market, as you're probably aware, it's part of the 4 freedoms, and one of the 4 freedoms is the freedom of movement, and that opens up all the discussion about migration again. That said, I do think the European Union misses the United Kingdom for 2 reasons. One, for our defence and security capacity. We are a nuclear power, yeah? And then secondly, I think in terms of student mobility, how many students can you just send to Ireland on an Erasmus scheme? You know, it would make much more sense if you could send some of these students to the United Kingdom. So I think mobility is one area where the EU would like to push, and I also think the EU would be very keen to get the United Kingdom playing a more firm, active hand in EU defence security policy. But those two things are very different from saying that they would countenance British membership. Gosh, the question about populists. How do we counteract kind of emotional narratives if we are engaging in a kind of more inclusive narrative? I do think that mainstream politicians have been slow to use emotional framing in the way they pitch their political responses. I think, you know, there's been an over-reliance on talking about policy when actually talking about some of the bigger, wider themes, I think, is a way to connect people more emotionally. What you really need, I think, is a kind of reverse populism, which is sort of inclusive. And you see it very occasionally with really charismatic speakers. I'm thinking of someone like Barack Obama. But you don't see it with Keir Starmer. And you don't see it with many mainstream politicians. And we do live, sadly in many ways, in an era of personality politics. So mainstream politicians have to be very thoughtful about how they are going to counteract some of this kind of emotional populist framing. We saw a good example of it, I think, in Poland, where Donald Tusk ran a very clever social media campaign, and the centre-right in Poland, as part of a wider coalition, has ended up in government. So I think there are ways that you can use social media to counteract it in a more inclusive framing, but I think most mainstream parties, as represented by Social Democrats, like the PD in Italy, or the Labour Party in the UK, or the CDU on the centre-right in Germany, I still think they've got a lot of kind of thinking to do about the way they kind of pitch their politics and they pitch their personalities.
Yes, thank you very much, Nicholas. I agree. For example, even to me, Obama was the last progressive or that was able to reframe in a particular way. And as far as Sir Starmer is concerned, for example, first of all, we have to remember that Jeremy Corbyn was pro-Brexit, and this is yes. But anyway, he leaned on that side, or anyway, he didn't take a real position. And that Mr. Starmer apparently, Sir Starmer apparently is sharing with Ms. Meloni the idea of how to deal with immigrants, etc. This is something that is very, very peculiar to the list.
Yes, sorry, yes. Coming on one point, we didn't talk migration, but the narrative of Vote Leave was take back control, and it was framed around migration and sovereignty. But net migration figures in the UK have continued to increase, legal migration since Brexit, and what we can classify illegal migration, refugees, asylum seekers, etc. The number of people trying to gain access to the UK illegally by small boats has also gone up significantly since the Brexit vote and since our withdrawal from the EU.
There's another, and then we leave the floor to the students. I was surprised this cost of the Brexit, 4% of GDP in the long term, yearly and per annum, that it's up to £32 billion a year. That's interesting because if you remember, we were the red double-decker bus by Brexit, £320 million a week we give to the EU. We will take back control. I made when you gave me this figure, it was very interesting because I made 320 million by 52, the other weeks of the year. It's up to 18.2 billion a year. So, figure on figure, it's a loss for UK of 13.8 billion in the very end. So that they are losing so much, and for sure this is one of the reasons they should be at least encouraged to come back. And of course, I said mine was a nasty question, but I would love the UK back. But as you said, with a completely different approach to the idea of the European Union, and not just being a kind of backdoor for the Americans with the special relationship that now is Poland, etc. Questions from the floor? We gave you Umberto, you are there.
Good morning. I have a question about the fact that you commented on tabloids and social media making the biggest part of the campaign about leaving leaving Europe. Do you think that this we are witnessing like a cultural regression about how we intend politics and about how the common citizen is informing himself about politics, and also how politics is more and more gaining power thanks based not on real information but on gossips and making an impression of a fun game, not anymore as something that matters, something that really matters. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll answer it. Thank you, really good question. Thank you very much. Yeah, actually, yes, social media plays a part in the Brexit referendum campaign, but I also think, the tabloids and the way their readers responded, and the fact that the newspapers are kind of accessible to the whole of the British public via, petrol stations and supermarkets and newsagents, I think that played an equally important part in terms of Brexit and the referendum result. In terms of cultural regression, yeah, I agree with you. We are really in my opinion, in a very difficult place at the moment in terms of the way Western democracy is positioning itself. We are living in an era where, as you alluded to, we see the news trivialised, and we see increasing amounts of disinformation, and I think you could make a case that maybe this is cyclical, and democracy will prevail, and that it will become things will change over the next few years, and we'll find ways of kind of combating this kind of cultural regression, and perhaps AI may play a part or whatever. But I don't feel overtly optimistic, I have to say. And I think what's happened in the United States will have an impact on the way Western European politics unfolds in terms of the way it's pitched and presented. I think this is a massive moment for the European Union. I really do think the European Union is at a crossroads in terms of how it responds in terms of its own security, its own defence, how it responds in terms of standing up for some of the principles it really believes in: democracy, the rule of law, equality, etc., etc. It's a very, very unsettling period in modern European history. It's difficult to predict what's going to happen and which way it will go. I speak to a lot of students. I teach at an American university, so a lot of my students are from the US. They're feeling pretty pessimistic, but actually, what some of the discussions I have with them and some of the ideas that they come up with does fill me with some optimism. I'm not trying to put the pressure on your generation, but I do think, and when I look at the British Gen Z, as we call it, the under 25s, of which my daughter is part of that age group, I think, well, actually, maybe give it time, give it a generational shift, things may turn out better than we think. Because one thing about your generation is when it comes to value issues, things like LGBTQ+, women's reproductive rights, on some levels, you can use all the disinformation and misinformation you like, but you can't put the generational genie back in the bottle, because these are the values that you've grown up with. Whereas my father, my late father, who died fairly recently, was brought up in a very different generation, and he died in his 90s. He didn't have that kind of, he couldn't relate to some of the issues that I've just mentioned in a way that I think your generation does. So that's a problem for populists, I think. Most Gen Z people are pretty liberal in terms of their attitudes and tolerance, thank you. And populists on the right in particular, we shouldn't exclude left-wing populists either, but populists on the right are not so good at being liberal and tolerant. So maybe, yeah, I'm going to take a long-term generational view on this so that I can smile but not reveal my front smile at the moment.
Thank you very much, Humberto. There was a question there.
Yeah.
If you want to say your name and...
My name is Celeste. I'm from Argentina, Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero. Thank you very much for your exposition. My question is related, I think, to the first question. Is, do you think that the use of algorithmic manipulation tactics designed to polarize and divide voters affected the legitimacy of the Brexit referendum?
Good question. Very good question. I mean, there's been a lot of stuff written about that, about Russian interference, external factors, external influence. If you want me to give a really honest answer, I'm not sure how much influence it may have had on the actual outcome of the referendum result. I suspect it may have had more influence since in keeping this kind of anti-EU rhetoric at front and centre of certain social media platforms. But in terms of the referendum, I don't know is the answer. I'm not as convinced as some in the kind of political science and communications community that played a substantial part in actually influencing the referendum result.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your lecture, first of all. My question is related to Erasmus. So I did my first Erasmus in UK, and in 2021, academic year 2021-2022, and teachers were all very happy to see us there, but also surprised. And I couldn't really answer the question that was, how is it possible that you are still here? So my question is it still possible for universities in the UK to sign some sorts of agreements with European universities, or are you completely out of the Erasmus game? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Whereabouts were you in the UK?
Wolverhampton.
Oh, Wolverhampton. I know it well. Interesting city.
Yeah.
Near Birmingham. Good football team. So, look, I think you were the last year of Erasmus by the time the cycle finished. I think you were the very last year when students could still take part in the Erasmus exchange, which meant that you got funding to come to the UK. And I hope you had a good time. Yes, look, we still have bilateral relations with European universities across the UK, but they're individual bilateral relationships. And the problem is we have this Turing scheme, which is a kind of so-called replacement of Erasmus, but actually a lot of it is focused on former Commonwealth countries like Australia, also the United States of America. So less and less people are going to from the UK to the EU nation states to learn languages. Because for us, Erasmus was all about learning languages, i.e. learning a second language after the UK. So what remains is most universities have kept links. So maybe they have one link with an Italian university, one with a French, but the problem is the funding isn't there, and so less students are going to the EU, and less EU students are coming to the UK because they're having to pay overseas fees. So it's not dead, but it's kind of withering away.
Thanks for the speech. And you talk about the perception of EU in the UK, and the perception of UK in the EU, I think. A related question is that how do you assess UK's role when it was one of EU? Like, did Britain make a positive influence when it was one of EU to the integration or the for the interest of the EU? Because I don't know if the interest of Britain and the EU will always be the same one. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, good question. Thank you. Well, look, in a way it's ironic, isn't it? Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister 1979 to 1992, 13 years, believed in membership of the European Community. She famously rattled her handbag about the budget contributions, but she was pretty instrumental in helping the single market get off the ground back in the 80s, and with other like-minded British political elites as well. And so it's a great irony to me that, you know, the UK helped to kind of create the single market and is no longer part of the single market. And it was the single market that the Brits really liked about the EU, because our economics in the 80s and the 90s, as you'll be aware, was very much kind of neoliberal driven, free trade. So that, I think, will always be the legacy of the United Kingdom's membership of the EU, is in terms of being one of the instrumental people for the launch of the single market. Plus, Margaret Thatcher was also in favour of the enlargement of the EU. She said that we had a moral obligation after the fall of the Berlin Wall to situate Eastern European countries in the European community, in the European Union. Now, she may have been doing that because she wanted to dilute the EU rather than deepen the EU. But nevertheless, I don't think the enlargement with all the Central and Eastern European states would have happened without some support from the United Kingdom in conjunction with France and Germany at the time. So I think there are some legacies that the UK can hang on to in terms of its historical relationship with the EU. Your second point of the question is the implication that the UK is not aligned perhaps to the EU and has more in common perhaps with the US, if I read into it, economically or with former Commonwealth countries. I'm not sure. I think globalization these days is all about big regional blocks, and big regional blocks that trade economically. And I think not being part of the largest market in the world, the single market, is, you know, really rather unresolvable for the UK if it's genuinely looking to try and improve its economic fortunes over the next 10, 20 years.
Hello. Well, first of all, you mentioned that Wolverhampton was a great football team. With all due respect, it really isn't. But
It is or isn't? Did you say?
It isn't.
Well, I'm a West Ham fan, sir.
I'm Villa.
You're Villa?
Yeah, it's going badly for us.
Same kit, you wear the same colours?
Yeah, but they're both not doing great. Anyway, you mentioned the deals with Australia after Brexit, and there was a bit of talk from both Theresa May and Johnson about CANZUK, about trying to make a union with Commonwealth countries and mostly English-speaking Commonwealth countries. Is that realistic? Have any steps been made towards closer relations with those countries?
Can I just add to that? I'm David Elwood. I teach at Johns Hopkins in Bologna, but I'm now living in Turin. Yesterday, a Conservative Member of Parliament said we have 75 free trade agreements across the world, almost all with English-speaking countries. Yesterday, I also heard 50% of students at Edinburgh University are not from Britain or Europe, 50%. Thirdly, yesterday evening, I heard on the World Service stories about Tanzania, about Nigeria, about India. The Brits console themselves, saying, we don't need Europe, we've got the rest of the world. We've got all the English-speaking world. We don't need Europe. And that's a very strong sentiment, not just in older people, but all the people. Don't forget that English-speaking people, their numbers are increasing. And in universities, in schools, less and less European languages are taught. So this is the way the alternative is created. I think the big problem with all this is Trump. Because if Trump starts putting on tariffs on British goods, just like he promised to do, threatens to do everywhere else, the Brits will really have to think again. Don't forget, Britain is the only country which still really believes in free trade.
Thank you both for your interventions there. Yes, you're absolutely right. Britain, full speed ahead, has signed up numerous free trade deals with lots of countries, lots of very small countries, lots of English-speaking countries. I don't know what the economic worth of those deals is compared to being in the biggest market in the world, the single market. I suspect it doesn't add up to quite the same economic impact for the United Kingdom. Largely speaking, to go back to the gentleman's question about closer Commonwealth ties more generally, I think it has been majority economic discussions that have taken place. You know, we still have the Commonwealth Games, which always ends up being in the United Kingdom because nowhere else outside the United Kingdom wants to host it. It's going to be in Glasgow next time round. You know, to me, it's part of this nostalgic retro topic, if that's a word. Look back to the past at a time when Britain ruled the waves, Britain Empire. I'm not sure how you can build in an era of global regions, how you can build on that linguistic, cultural heritage in concrete terms, politically and economically.
May I add something? This is interesting. During the Brexit, it was one of the posts by Levy was, it is the European Union, not the Commonwealth, that is unfit for Britain. And then you really closed on something that to me is very important. Because even about the data he was referring, and Norbert Chancellor was saying, British universities are in crisis because there are not foreign students. But my question is, isn't it a bit limiting, imagining that the UK is an ideal destination just to learn the English language? In the sense, first, as you said, actually British universities are very well renowned for the standards. This is what is important. Unfortunately, is that the standards are not so high when you are in a neoliberal economy. And then, last but not least, don't you think that it's a way of really kind of saying a bit snobbish, because it is like Italy says, we could live on tourism. Frankly speaking, I don't think Italy can survive only on tourism, as the United Kingdom cannot survive only on universities, because the major part of the revenues made by an economy must be done by something else, services, etc. So what do you think about this? Sorry, and I end up. I was in Brussels at the Joint Research Centre of the Commission just before you were really physically leaving, and I said, hey, what about all the UK commissioners and people? It says, well, top level will be fired, and we will keep mid-level officers because they speak English. Terrible.
Yes, good points. And you're right about the reliance of British universities on foreign students, and they're tending not to be European students. And it's particularly at the master's level where they can set their own fees. I think one of the real things that's caused the crisis at undergraduate level has been the dearth of European students that we used to get at undergraduate level, in terms of not just the numbers, but quality of students as well. So I think it's had a kind of dual impact there. But you're absolutely right about the situation in terms of master's students, which is universities becoming not desperate, but really keen to fill up their numbers, and so they're having to call on international students from across the globe. Yeah, it would be a shame if all that we're remembered for is our language, wouldn't it? You know, I mean, French is the language of diplomacy, so I'm told. And that said, I'd be very surprised if English doesn't remain such a dominant language in the European Union. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because English took on a more important part of that when the Central and Eastern European countries joined, because most MEPs from those countries didn't speak French or had no knowledge of French. So, yeah, maybe that's the legacy of the UK, isn't it? The English language in the European Union. I hope it amounts to a bit more than that.
Okay, there is one more question. Okay, one more question for you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. So first of all, thank you for your lecture. I see we are short in time, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. So I wanted to ask you a question regarding the data you showed us about the percentage of the generation of how different generations voted in the Brexit referendum. Because I read that even in some English villages in which the European Union actually invested a lot of resources for public works, this percentage were the same, or in some cases even higher than the one you showed us, because this presence of the European Union was counterbalanced by a strong anti-immigrant sentiment feeling. Therefore, I wanted to ask, in your opinion, to what extent the European Union was also at fault for the outcome of the Brexit referendum, because during this cycle of seminars we also analyzed how the European Union has a problem when defining a kind of European identity of citizenship. And therefore, my question is, if at this specific point in time there was something the European Union could do to better integrate the UK or to better accommodate its instances?
Well, if you remember, David Cameron went to the European Union and asked to kind of have a few softeners to help him win his referendum campaign around things like availability to access healthcare for migrants, that kind of stuff. Look, yes, part of the narrative is, this can't just be a narrative about the UK. I think it's primarily a narrative about the UK. But there is part of this narrative which is about the EU, perhaps not reforming in the way it could have done in some areas. I think we would be wrong to just look at this holistically from it's the UK's fault point of view. Perhaps one of the reasons why we do see a rise in right-wing and left-wing populism across European Union nation states has something to do with the EU, the disconnect that people feel from the EU. It's a long way away. What do they get from it? What is it doing for them? I do believe that we don't teach enough about the EU in European Union schools. Not to indoctrinate students, but to tell them, why was it set up? What does it do? What's it for? Why should it reform? British students have got very, very little idea. They didn't have much idea when we were in the EU about what the EU is. In my opinion, it should be part of every single European Union citizen's education. It should be part of their citizenship education. You've all got EU citizenship, those of you that are from EU nation states in this room. And if you've got citizenship, you should feel a European Union identity. But I wonder how many of you do. And I think we have failed, actually, in Europe generally, not all countries, to really promote what the European Union is about, so that people fully understand it.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Before I take...
Oh, there is a video that Professor Conoscenti would love to show you. Yes. So we are running out of time. Michelangelo, please do it very quickly.
We are. It's 4 minutes to 4.
Okay.
So, Nicholas mentioned that the United Kingdom has been considered an awkward partner. In early 1980, the BBC broadcast a very nice TV series, was Yes Minister. It was when Margaret Thatcher was And this is what they were discussing. It's a very nice satirical, is yes minister, and then was yes prime minister. And
Very cynical.
very cynical, yes. And so listen what this officer supporting the minister says about the European Union.
Yes, it is muted.
Oh, no, okay, and you're right. Thank you. You're right. Okay.
So didn't you do your boxes last month? No, I was redrafting the draft.
Well, briefly, Minister, Brussels is about to decree that there should be a new European identity card to be carried by all citizens of the EEC. Now, the Foreign Office is quite ready to go along with it as a quid pro quo for a deal over the Butter Mountain, the Wine Lake, and the Milk Ocean. The Land War and the Cod Stick. And quite obviously, the Prime Minister wants you to introduce the legislation.
Me?
Yes, well, it's well known that you're pro-Europe, you see. And it would simplify our administration enormously in the long run, so it's a good idea.
Good idea.
Good idea.
Good idea.
Not a good idea?
Political suicide?
Trying to make British people carry compulsory identification papers. They'll say I'm introducing a police state again. Is this what we fought 2 world wars for, Humphrey?
Well, Minister, it's really little more than a sort of driving license.
It's the last nail in my coffin, that's what it is.
You might get away with calling it Euro Club Express.
Why do we have to introduce it? Can't the Foreign Office do it?
Well, in fact, that was the Prime Minister's original suggestion, but the Foreign Secretary thought that this was a Home Office matter, and the Home Office took the view that it was essentially an administrative matter, and the Prime Minister agreed.
They're all playing pass the parcel.
Can you blame them when you can hear it ticking?
Well, I'm afraid that the identity card bill is planned to be the last action of this department.
Wonderful ammunition for the anti-Europeans.
Yes, don't the Foreign Office realise what damage this will do to the European idea?
Well, I'm sure they do. That's why they support it.
Well, sure, the Foreign Office is pro-Europe, isn't it?
Yes and no. If you'll forgive the expression. The Foreign Office is pro-Europe because it is really anti-Europe. The civil service was united in its desire to make sure that the common market didn't work. That's why we went into it.
What are you talking about?
No, sir. Britain has had the same foreign policy objective for at least the last 500 years, to create a disunited Europe. In that cause, we have fought with the Dutch against the Spanish, with the Germans against the French, with the French and Italians against the Germans, and with the French against the Germans and Italians. Divide and rule, you see. Why should we change now, when it's worked so well?
Okay, let's stop. Let's stop here. It's longer, you can find it, but this is the idea. We are pro-Europe because we are anti-Europe. Sorry for this. Now, it's the BBC.
Thank you very much, Professor Startin. Thank you very much, Professor Startin.